you'd say, oh my goodness, the Middle East was so far ahead in the ninth century, in the year 900,
Yeah.
or on up through the 12th century.
Dr. Hoffman, is there a period in history that we can point to and say, this is when the Middle East fell behind Europe?
All right. Yes, I mean, we could talk about that, but we have to make it clear, what do we mean by fall behind?
Yeah, actually, that's a great
Yeah.
that's a great
And
comeback.
there,
Yeah,
there can be many things.
exactly.
Um, and they're not necessarily connected.
Yeah.
There might be a relationship, but if we think about it, um, you think about maybe three possible domains where you could fall behind. One
Okay.
might be intellectual. Think of modern science, which is so important for not only for conquest, but even more important for economic growth.
Yep. Yep.
But if you think of the intellectual arena broadly defined, you'd say, oh my goodness, the Middle East was so far ahead in the ninth century, in the year 900,
Yeah.
or on up through the 12th century. Now, I'm not a specialist in intellectual history. If you think of the flow of ideas, where did the West in the Middle Ages learn about Greek philosophy, about Aristotle? Well, it came via the Middle East.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Greek learning was translated into Arabic and then eventually into Latin in various places. That's how the West learned about Aristotle and Greek philosophy and Greek science. Now, but there's some interesting research that suggests that Arabic science writing declined in the 11th and 12th century, and for reasons that had nothing to do, for instance, with Islam necessarily, and more to do with politics and change. I can talk about that.
Yeah. I'm intrigued now. How so? Why would the sort of
All right.
scientific writing?
And there's further evidence of decline with the delay, at least in the Ottoman Empire, in using the printing press until the 18th century. And this
Wait,
is
it
not
took
my,
the Ottomans that long to pick up
yes,
printing, the
yeah,
18th century?
yeah. And this is
Oh, wow.
research that some fellow economic historians and political scientists who do history have done. Um, I should mention their names: and Eric Cheney at Oxford, Metin Joskol, and Jared Rubin here at Chapman University. Metin Joskol's in Connecticut, and others. But what happened? It's it's a it's an interesting story, but and it's linked to politics.
Yeah,
And
you keep on mentioning that. I'm
how
intrigued now.
how okay,
How? Yeah.
think about this. Uh, what happened in a number of Middle Eastern states
Mm-hmm.
was that instead of establishing representative assemblies, something like a parliament,
Yeah.
to raise tax revenue. Okay, most of these tax revenue is spent on warfare. All right, this
Yeah.
comes back to the old model. Hey, how are you going to conquer? Well, you have to pay the soldiers. You have to buy the supplies and everything. You need tax revenue. And in much of Western Europe, may have eventually monarchs who arise from what were fighting warlords in up through the year 1000. And in these monarchies that eventually develop, you, in the long run, by the 15th century or 16th century, you begin to get representative assemblies of some sort that have a voice in negotiating about what's going to be taxed.
Yeah, and by the way, correct me if I'm wrong. Those representative assemblies are not necessarily democracies. They could be a bunch of
No,
lords and barons.
right. What
Okay.
essentially happened is the powerful lord, he has a court with other powerful warlords.
Yeah.
But to get more money, he'll bring in representatives, say, from cities.
Yeah.
And this is a way that in return for some privileges, maybe some voice in taxation, some voice in what's taxed, what's not, how the level of taxation, they get certain privileges like, okay, we don't put soldiers in our town or build, fortifications for us, or don't tax us too much. They get a voice. And this is not democratic. It's a tiny minority that
Yeah.
has a voice, but it does enlarge the number of people who have a voice. And it has another effect. It raises tax revenues a lot. So if you give people a voice, they'll maybe begrudgingly, they'll pay more in taxes. And
You gotta. They have a tiny share of a bigger pie now.
right. And it may mean, well, we're going to put taxes on the peasants, but we get some kind of exemption. Right.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
All right. You don't get that in the Middle East. Instead, what you often get is a different political solution to a problem of how am I going to get a way of fighting? Well, I may have relied on other lords and so on, but I need something more. But instead of establishing a parliament, often you establish something like the Janissaries.
The special elite forces out of Ottomans.
Elite forces of military slaves to get special privileges. But it's not the same as representation. And you may say, okay, this solves a problem. You now have a palace guard that protects you, the ruler, and can fight for you. But it doesn't have the same economic effects. It doesn't encourage sort of city growth. And it also means, and this is what some of this research has shown by Eric Cheney and Lisa Blades at Stanford, she's a political scientist, that it means that after about the year 800 in Europe, the
year 800 or 1800?
800.
800.
That early.
800 in Europe. Okay.
Stable rulers. They begin to negotiate more. They haven't established the parliaments yet. In the Middle East, regimes in Europe had been terribly unstable. A king would be assassinated.
Yeah.
Had a high probability that the chance of being assassinated as a king were as high as being dying on the front lines or being killed on the front lines in warfare today.
Wow, under those conditions, who would want to be king?
You begin to get stable rule. They choose rules of succession. Well, the next king will be the son of. You don't get that in the Middle East. So you get fights over who's going to be the next ruler. So you get unstable rule. And eventually, later on, you get these parliaments with cities, and that has an enormous effect on the economy because these cities grow, their trade expands, and this is in the Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th centuries, and 14th, 15th centuries. And their growth of cities and cities, clusters of cities, is unique to Western Europe. So these political changes have a big effect on the economy, have a big effect on taxation and warfare. But to get back to the question here, the question was, hey, what about intellectual matter like printing?
Yeah.
Parliaments could help eventually establish the legitimacy of rulers. Okay. And where you had them in Western Europe after the 14th, 15th, 16th century. How do you establish the legitimacy in rulers in the Middle East? increasingly, or Cheney and Jared Rubin have shown, you relied on the clergy, um, on and people who train to read the Quran and explicate Islamic law, and they become increasingly important. And so this is not something inherent to Islam. This is a political change. And what Cheney has shown is that as this happens, scientific writing declines, and reliance on the clerics also later on becomes an obstacle to importing the printing press. Why? Well, if you rely on the clergy for legitimacy, anything that threatens their legitimacy, their monopoly over what's true, you bring in a printing press, you're going to get someone competing with them. And you may say, well, why didn't that happen in Western Europe? Well, the printing press came in, the clergy accepted it, and it was, there was censorship, but that doesn't happen in at least in the Ottoman Empire, where a lot of this research is done. So that's the key thing. It's a result of the political structure, and it doesn't happen in Western Europe because increasingly the monarchs rely on parliaments for legitimacy. They don't have to rely on the clergy.
Less and less so over the centuries.
This is not something that happens overnight.
In talking about what when the Middle East fell behind, I use "fall behind" in quotations here. Europe, you said there are three domains. The first one was the intellectual, which you and I can have 4 podcasts on that. That was fascinating. What are the 2 other? You said 3.
Okay, and you better not have me because I'm not a specialist on intellectual history, but. The other 2 are military and economic.
Which kind of go hand in hand with what you were just discussing.
They do. They go hand in hand. There is a link with the intellectual later on, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. But let's look at the military side of things. And you say, well, when does the Middle East fall behind, so to speak, militarily?
Yeah.
Well, you might say maybe about the year 1000, because after the year 1000, the expansion of Muslim forces reaches a limit. Okay, at least as far as Western Europe is concerned. And
so they conquer Spain and they don't go beyond that. It's
Andalusia. They don't go beyond that. Okay. And I don't quite agree with this. Because what about the Ottoman expansion into southeastern Europe, the conquest of the Byzantine Empire? That's the Eastern Roman Empire that lasts up to 1453. It's Greek speaking and so on, but the Ottomans overrun it, conquer modern day Istanbul, Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire, and they advance deeper into Europe in the 15th and 16th century. They threaten Vienna. So I think it's not the year 1000. It's maybe later. I mean, the Ottomans attack Vienna in 1683, but by then their forces are not as strong. They're not as big a threat. And by the early 1700s, they're defeated by the Russians. They're no longer a great power.
One point that I wanted to add from my own research, if I may please, about the expansion of the Ottoman Empire militarily, it goes along what we've been discussing about technology and science. Some of the major cannons, artillery that they used in the siege of Constantinople actually came from Europe.
Yes.
It came from Poland. It
Yeah.
wasn't sort of
Yeah.
ingrown indigenous technology from the
Right. They
Ottomans
hired,
themselves.
and that was something I wanted to touch upon because it says something um, about who's got the lead. Who are you going to buy your weapons from?
Yeah.
Who are you going to hire as mercenaries or as advisors? You can see this in China as well.
Yeah.
At the end of the Ming Dynasty in China in the early 17th century, they were pressing Jesuit missionaries into service to help test cannons. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And so with the Ottomans, the fact that they were relying on they're either buying or hiring cannon founders in the West to make their cannons tells you something. There's a term from economics about this, which is maybe there's some jargon, revealed preference, but the idea is simple. Hey, if you have two things and you say, hey, I'm going to buy my cannon here and not there, what does it tell you about what's better? Assuming that
Yeah.
the prices are the same.
You call the term revealed preference?
Revealed preference,
Okay.
which is better, okay, or which do you like more?
They
Um,
weren't buying their, cannons from the, I don't know, Fatimi to the south. I mean,
right
they were
now,
not the same with the Persians to the east. Yeah, I
yeah,
get it.
and by the 18th century, they're buying naval ships from the West. So why this says something about who's ahead, even if you can't get the historians' smoking gun document. Pardon
Yeah.
that
Well, this is a good
uh,
pun.
these guys are ahead. There are claims that Ottoman authorities recognized that Western artillery and Western ships were better in the 16th century. This comes from Bernard Lewis, and I know his views
Yeah.
may be controversial, um, but I think this notion of where do you get it that tells you something.
Exactly. Even though Bernard Lewis's some of his writings are controversial, it's still just a treasure trove of information.
Oh
I
yeah,
recommend
yeah,
anyone to read it, even if you agree or disagree with
and
it.
yeah, and a delight to read. I should
They
add.
really are. He's a great writer.
Yeah,
I've read two of his books. I wanted to add here one element, maybe it's a sub element to the three elements that you talked about: intellectual, military, and economic. What do you think, Dr. Hoffman, about strong institutions? You kind of touched on it. Parliament. It seems like, they'll say the Sultan or the Shah of Iran or the Mughal Sultan. I'm not sure what they would call him, or the Shah, the Emperor of the Mughal Empire. They were more or less very much personalized governments, even though they had.
yeah,
Yeah, I'd love to hear your take on that.
yeah. You want strong institutions, strong enough to provide security. And this would actually bring us into the third element, the economic element.
Yeah,
You want them to provide security. You want them to protect your person, protect your property, secure property rights, secure ideas you have, inventions, all of that. But you don't want them to be so strong that they're threatening, that they're and that there's a risk that they will take your property, take your life, take your invention, without at least some kind of compensation.
yeah,
And that's a big issue. And things like a parliament help here, because they limit, potentially can limit the authority of a ruler. And it's worth keeping in mind the Western rulers who create parliaments in the late Middle Ages of the 16th century, they are essentially terribly weak. They're much weaker than the Ottoman sultans.
If I may add to that, or perhaps further refine it, what you're saying essentially is that the monarchs of Western Europe are weaker within their own domains in comparison to the monarchs of
Yeah,
Asia in their
right.
respective domains.
Yeah. And someone
That's
like
interesting.
Machiavelli would talk about this in the middle of the 16th century. He would say, the Sultan doesn't have to consult with, city leaders or parliaments. He can just Yeah, but that weakness obliged or forced these rulers to create a parliament, negotiate. In the long run, they got more tax revenue and they became stronger for it. But it was because there was some protection. Um, and in the long run, that um, that hurt the Ottomans and the other powers in the Middle East. I mean, it's
That's
clear.
really fascinating. And by the way, formation of parliaments and getting more taxes. As I shared with you, one of your colleagues, I spoke with Dr. Barry Eichengreen. He talked about how that in turn allowed Western European countries, which are more stable, to get more debt, the
Oh
national
yeah, they
debt
could
to
borrow, and that's essential for fighting. Why? Well, think about to take a modern example from the U.S. People sometimes worry about government spending
Yeah,
relative to GDP,
yeah,
or ta- if you look at government spending relative to GDP, when was it highest? World War II, and with good reason.
yeah.
You had heavy spending in war. Well, during the war, spending soars. It climbs. You can raise taxes, but they can't keep pace with the spending. What you need to do is borrow,
Yeah.
to pay for the warfare, to pay for the armies, the navies, everything else, and then pay back those loans later on. Um, Western European rulers managed to do this. And if they had a powerful parliament, that helped because it meant, hey, these loans will be paid back. They're a safe investment. When kings borrowed,
Yeah.
that wasn't the case if they borrowed loan. And this was a problem. It was a problem. Just as an aside, take the French. They borrowed heavily to fight wars in the 18th century. And they hit upon a financial innovation, which was selling essentially life annuities.
Life
So
annuities. Okay.
if I want to, I'm say a 55-year-old male, and I don't have any children, or I can't rely on them in my old age, so I want to have some income when I can no longer work. So I lend the equivalent of $1,000 to the government, and they in return pay me $100 a year for as long as I live. That's a life annuity. It's like a pension plan that gives you an income. It's a private pension.
That's a good
The
deal. So
government,
Louis the 14th, 15, 16 are doing
yeah,
this until you have a
yeah.
revolution and
And there
everything
were
changes.
loads of buyers, wealthy people who needed this kind of loan, or you could buy it for a child or something. Um, Great idea. You're lending money to the government, you're giving them $1,000. They're paying you. All right. Uh, they sold a bunch of these in the 18th century. Um, and they soon were selling them and saying, okay, these are the terms no matter how old you are or anything else. Well, wait, if you're an 18th century investment banker, you say, or savvy individual, you say, great, I'm going to buy, this is the ultimate version of this
Yeah.
idea. I'm going to buy, say, 25 of these, each one dependent, will be paid as long as an 18-year-old girl from a wealthy family who had already had smallpox and therefore had a big life expectancy
Yeah.
lives. I know she's going to live a long time. I'm going to buy 25 of these, um, each one dependent on the lives of 25 young women, and they will keep paying for a long time. And they're giving me 10%. They're going to live for 50, 60, 70 years. And if one gets run over by a carriage, doesn't matter. I got 24. Then I'm going to sell shares in this investment pool to wealthy investors.
In this deal, the French government is getting shafted.
Yeah, exactly. You got it. And this was devised by bankers in Geneva. There are other people doing this. And the net result was, yes, this is a fair deal for the 55-year-old male, but
For
for
an
these other
18-year-old,
investors,
yeah.
it's this causes the French government to go bankrupt, helps trigger the French Revolution, and but that's an aside.
Yeah. So, but you bring up this example to give a contrast between uh,
The Middle East and
the Middle East, and also in France, the king was much stronger than the
right,
king of England,
right,
and they had a better sort of
right,
taxation system, parliament system that wouldn't let something like that happen.
right. And they could borrow more and borrow at a lower interest rate. So
Exactly.
that's
That's
eventually
amazing.
all the Western European nations do this.
Do this. We'll be back after a short break to talk
Okay.
about having fallen behind, whatever that definition means. Why did the Middle East stay behind? We'll be back.
Okay.